Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I had a restless itch to escape the city grind, so I packed up my old RV and headed out to Pine Hollow campgrounds. Nestled deep in the sprawling forests of Oregon, it promised the kind of peace I was yearning for. I didn't tell many people about my trip. Just needed some alone time, you know? Just me, nature, and the hum of solitude. When I finally arrived, the place looked even better than I imagined. Towering pines surrounded the camp, their tips swaying gently in the breeze. The sun was just setting, casting a warm orange glow that made the whole scene almost surreal. I found a nice spot near a small creek, parked my RV, and started setting up camp. The air was cool and the smell of pine and earth was intoxicating. I was a bit of a loner, had been all my life. But this solitude was different. It was refreshing, almost healing. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird settling in for the night. I was in the middle of preparing dinner when I noticed someone approaching. It was a man, maybe in his late 30s, with a rough, rugged look. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder and wore hiking boots caked with mud. "Hey there," he greeted with a friendly wave. "Mind if I join you?" I wasn't expecting company, but he seemed harmless enough. "Sure, why not?" I replied, offering him a seat by the fire. He introduced himself as Frank. We exchanged the usual small talk. Where we were from, what brought us out here. Frank said he was an avid hiker, loved exploring off-the-beaten-path places. There was something about his demeanor that put me at ease, and before long we were swapping stories and sharing a meal. As the night wore on, Frank's stories took a darker turn. He spoke of an elusive treasure hidden somewhere in these woods, an old legend passed down through generations. I could see the glint of obsession in his eyes as he described it. Gold coins, precious gems, and ancient artifacts worth millions. "Most people think it's just a myth," he said, leaning in closer. "But I know it's real. I found clues, bits and pieces that prove its existence." I couldn't help but be intrigued. It sounded like the plot of a movie, but Frank seemed genuinely convinced. We stayed up late, talking about the treasure and speculating on where it might be hidden. By the time we called it a night, I felt like I'd known Frank for years, despite having met him only hours ago. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of fresh coffee. Frank had already started a pot brewing on the campfire. We decided to spend the day exploring the woods, see if we could stumble upon any clues about the treasure. It was a wild goose chase, but it sounded like fun. We hiked deep into the forest, following trails that seemed to grow narrower and less defined the farther we went. The trees were dense, the branches forming a thick canopy that filtered the sunlight into a dim, greenish glow. It was beautiful, but there was an eerie quality to it as well. As we ventured further, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Frank seemed unfazed, his focus entirely on the hunt for the treasure. We stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin around midday. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the wood rotting and the roof caved in. Frank's eyes lit up when he saw it. "This could be it," he said, excitement evident in his voice. "Let's check it out." The cabin was dark and musty inside, the air thick with dust. There were remnants of old furniture scattered around, a broken chair here, a rusted stove there. We carefully picked our way through the debris, looking for anything that might point to the treasure. In one corner, we found a trap door hidden beneath a pile of rubble. Frank pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but curiosity got the better of me. We descended the stairs, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a small, dank cellar. The walls were lined with old shelves, and in the center of the room was a large wooden chest. Frank approached it eagerly, his hands trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside, we found an assortment of old papers, maps, and what looked like a journal. Frank's excitement was palpable as he sifted through the contents. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what we've been looking for." I wasn't so sure. Something about the place felt wrong. The air was thick with an oppressive sense of dread, and the shadows seemed to shift and move on their own. I wanted to leave, but Frank was too absorbed in his discovery to notice my unease. He pulled out one of the maps, spreading it out on the floor. It was old and faded, but the markings were clear. There was a spot circled in red, not far from where we were. "We have to go there," Frank said, his voice filled with urgency. "That's where the treasure is." I hesitated. "Maybe we should come back with more supplies. This place gives me the creeps." Frank shook his head. "No, we can't waste any time. We're so close." Reluctantly, I agreed. We gathered the maps and journal, then made our way back up the stairs. The forest seemed even more foreboding as we set out toward the marked location. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and I couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. After what felt like hours of trudging through the dense undergrowth, we finally reached the spot marked on the map. It was a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees. In the center was a large, flat stone with strange symbols carved into it. Frank knelt down, examining the stone closely. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entrance to the treasure chamber." I looked around nervously. "Are you sure about this? Maybe we should—" Before I could finish, Frank pressed one of the symbols on the stone. There was a grinding noise, and the stone shifted, revealing a hidden staircase descending into the earth. Frank didn't hesitate. He started down the stairs, and with a heavy sigh, I followed. The staircase was long and steep, the air growing colder the deeper we went. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a large, cavernous chamber. The walls were lined with ancient artifacts, golden statues, jeweled crowns, and glittering coins. It was a treasure trove, just like Frank had said. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, and on it lay a body. It was old and withered, the skin stretched tight over the bones. But what caught my attention were the symbols carved into the flesh, identical to the ones on the stone outside. Frank approached the altar, his eyes wide with awe. "This must be the guardian of the treasure," he said, reaching out to touch the body. "Frank, don't—" I started, but it was too late. The moment his fingers brushed the corpse, there was a loud crack, and the ground began to shake. The walls trembled, and chunks of stone started to fall. We had to get out of there fast. We turned and ran back up the stairs, the chamber collapsing behind us. By the time we reached the surface, the entrance had sealed itself, leaving no trace of the staircase. We stood there, panting and covered in dust, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Frank was ecstatic. "We found it," he said, a wild look in his eyes. "We actually found it." I wasn't so sure. The experience had left me shaken, and I couldn't help but feel that we'd disturbed something that should have been left alone. But Frank was too caught up in his discovery to notice. We made our way back to camp in silence, the weight of what we'd found hanging heavy in the air. That night, as we sat by the fire, Frank pored over the maps and journal, planning our next move. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I didn't sleep that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what we might have unleashed. The next morning I woke to find Frank gone. His belongings were still there, but there was no sign of him. I searched the camp and the surrounding woods, but he had vanished without a trace. As I sat by the fire, trying to make sense of it all, I noticed something glinting in the ashes. It was a small golden amulet, the same one I'd seen on the body in the chamber. I picked it up, the metal cool against my skin. I knew then that whatever we had found in those woods was far from over, and as I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I drove away from Pine Hollow, the trees closing in behind me, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Frank standing there, watching me go. I never saw him again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I still have the amulet tucked away in a drawer, a constant reminder of the treasure we found and the price we paid. It was a sunny afternoon when I pulled up my RV to a secluded spot in the Joshua Tree National Park. After a week of stressful work, I needed this break. The dry desert air and the sight of rugged rock formations were a welcome change from my usual cityscape. I parked near a small cluster of Joshua trees and set up camp, looking forward to a weekend of solitude and relaxation. Once everything was in place, I settled into a lawn chair, cold beer in hand, and let my mind wander. The vast expanse of the desert stretched out before me, a landscape dotted with cacti and the occasional rabbit darting between rocks. It was a perfect picture of tranquility. But tranquility never lasts. Around dusk, as the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange, I noticed a figure moving in the distance. At first I thought it was another camper, but something about the way they moved made me uneasy. The person seemed to be dragging something heavy behind them. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed my binoculars and took a closer look. The figure was a tall, muscular man with a wild, unkempt beard, wearing tattered clothes. He was dragging a large duffel bag, which appeared to be stained with something dark. I felt a chill despite the warm evening air. Maybe it was just an overactive imagination, but something about the scene felt off. I decided to keep an eye on him from a distance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, the man disappeared behind a rocky outcrop. I waited, hoping he would reappear, but he didn't. Unease settled into the pit of my stomach. Deciding it was best to stay cautious, I locked the doors of my RV and made sure my hunting knife was within reach. Night fell, bringing with it a cool breeze that rustled the dry leaves of the Joshua trees. The desert was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the occasional coyote howl and the rustling of small critters. I tried to sleep but found myself tossing and turning, the image of the bearded man and his duffel bag haunting my thoughts. Around midnight, I heard a soft tap on the side of my RV. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear any other sounds. The tap came again, followed by a low whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling. Gathering my courage, I peered through the small window beside my bed. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was the man. He stood just outside my RV, his face partially hidden by the shadows. His eyes, however, were clearly visible and filled with a cold, calculating look. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him slowly circle the RV, his eyes never leaving the windows. He stopped at the door and tried the handle. Thank God I had locked it. Frustrated, he muttered something under his breath and moved to the rear of the vehicle. I took this opportunity to quietly grab my knife and phone, ready to defend myself if needed. Minutes felt like hours as I listened to him rummage around outside. I considered calling the park rangers but dismissed the idea, thinking it would take too long for them to arrive. My best bet was to stay quiet and hope he would leave. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of something being slashed. Panic set in as I realized he was cutting the tires. If he succeeded, I would be trapped with no way to escape. Summoning every ounce of courage, I opened the small window and yelled, "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The man looked up, surprised but not frightened. He slowly stood up, a hunting knife glinting in his hand. "Just making sure you don't go anywhere," he replied with a twisted smile. I felt a surge of adrenaline. "Get the hell away from my RV or I swear I'll use this," I threatened, brandishing my own knife. He chuckled darkly. "We'll see about that," he said, before disappearing into the shadows. My heart pounded as I tried to think of my next move. The RV was now compromised, and I had no way of knowing where he had gone. I needed to get out of there, but with the tires slashed, my options were limited. I decided to make a run for it. Grabbing a flashlight and my hunting knife, I quietly exited through the side door, keeping low to avoid being seen. The desert night was cold, and the wind howled as I made my way toward the nearest trailhead, hoping to find help or at least put some distance between myself and the maniac. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I moved quickly but cautiously, my senses on high alert. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a small cabin in the distance, its windows glowing with the warm light of a fire. Relief washed over me as I approached the cabin. I knocked urgently on the door, praying someone would answer. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with a shotgun in hand. "What's going on?" he asked, eyeing me suspiciously. Please, you've got to help me, I pleaded. There's a man out there. He slashed my tires and tried to break into my RV. I think he's dangerous. The old man nodded, his expression hardening. Come inside quickly. He led me into the cabin, which was small but cozy, filled with old furniture and the smell of burning wood. Name's Walter, he said, offering me a seat by the fire. You picked a bad time to be out here alone. I recounted the events of the evening, my voice trembling slightly as I described the man and his actions. Walter listened intently, his grip tightening on the shotgun. I've heard of people like him, he said once I finished. Drifters who prey on campers and hikers. We've had a few incidents over the years, but nothing this bold. What should we do? I asked, hoping he had a plan. Stay here for the night, Walter replied. In the morning, we'll head to the ranger station and report this. For now, we need to keep watch and make sure he doesn't come back. I agreed, feeling a bit more secure with Walter's presence and his shotgun. The hours dragged on as we sat in silence, the fire crackling softly. Around dawn, just as the sky began to lighten, we heard footsteps outside the cabin. Walter motioned for me to stay put and crept towards the window. He peered out, then quickly ducked back down. It's him, he whispered. He's looking for you. My heart raced as I glanced around the cabin for anything I could use to defend myself. Walter handed me a heavy iron poker, his eyes grim. If he comes in, we fight. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. The handle rattled, then the door slowly creaked open. The man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. Found you, he sneered, stepping forward with his knife raised. Before he could move any closer, Walter fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Back off, or the next one's in your head, he growled. The man hesitated, eyes flicking between Walter and me. For a moment I thought he might actually back down, but then with a snarl he lunged at Walter, knife flashing in the dim light. I acted on instinct, swinging the iron poker with all my strength. It connected with the man's arm, causing him to drop the knife and howl in pain. Walter seized the opportunity and tackled him to the ground, the shotgun clattering to the floor. The struggle was fierce, but with both of us fighting, we managed to subdue the man and tie him up with some old ropes Walter had in the cabin. Panting and bruised, we finally took a step back to assess the situation. We need to get him to the Rangers, Walter said, wiping sweat from his brow. They'll know what to do. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. We kept watch over the man until the sun was fully up, then set out for the ranger station, dragging our captive along. The Rangers were shocked by our story but acted quickly, taking the man into custody and arranging for my RV to be towed back to safety. As I sat in the ranger station, sipping on a cup of coffee, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude. Despite the terror of the night, I had survived, and with Walter's help, we had stopped a dangerous man from harming anyone else. The events of that night would stay with me forever, a stark reminder of how quickly tranquility can turn into terror, but I refused to let it haunt me. Life was too short to live in fear. I was parked at a small, run-down RV campground off a back road in rural Pennsylvania, having decided to take a solo trip to clear my head after a rough few months. The campground wasn't much to look at, just a few scattered spots with hookups and a dilapidated building that served as an office and general store. It wasn't peak season, so I figured I'd have some peace and quiet. As I set up my RV and got everything situated, I noticed a couple of other campers, an older man in a faded baseball cap a few spots down and a young couple who looked like they were arguing as they set up their tent. I didn't think much of it. People had their own issues, and I was here to escape mine. By late afternoon, I had settled in and decided to take a walk around the area. The campground was bordered by dense woods, and there was a faint trail leading off into them. I figured a little hike would do me good, so I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet, but I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place. I followed the trail, which was barely visible under the fallen leaves and overgrown brush. After about an hour of walking, I found a small clearing with the remnants of an old cabin. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it, hoping to find something interesting. The cabin was more of a shack, really. The roof had caved in, and the wooden walls were rotting away. As I poked around, I found some old, rusted tools and a few pieces of broken furniture. It was clear no one had been here for years. I took a few pictures with my phone, thinking they might make for some cool shots to show friends. On my way back, I noticed something odd. The path I had followed seemed different, almost like it had shifted. I tried not to let it bother me, but as I walked, I realized I had no idea where I was. My heart rate picked up a bit, and I started to retrace my steps, hoping to find the familiar trail markers. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled back onto the campground. Relieved, I headed straight to my RV, only to find the door ajar. My stomach dropped as I approached cautiously. Inside, it was clear someone had been through my things. Clothes were strewn about, and drawers had been opened. My first thought was the young couple or the old man, but I had no proof. Angry and unsettled, I decided to confront them. I walked over to the older man's RV first. He was sitting outside, whittling a piece of wood. When I asked if he had seen anyone near my RV, he just shrugged and said he hadn't noticed anything. His eyes had a certain coldness to them that made me uneasy. Next, I approached the young couple. They were sitting by a small fire, still looking tense from their earlier argument. They seemed genuinely surprised when I told them about the break-in and denied having seen anything. I wasn't sure if I believed them, but there wasn't much I could do. Feeling frustrated and violated, I returned to my RV. I locked the door, checked the windows, and decided to call it a night. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild after the day's events. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud banging on my door. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no answer. The banging continued, more insistent this time. I swung the door open, shining the flashlight outside, but there was no one there. Feeling a mix of anger and fear, I stepped outside, scanning the area with the flashlight. That's when I noticed the old man's RV door was wide open and his lights were off. Something felt off, so I decided to check it out. As I approached his RV, the smell hit me first, a sickly metallic odor that made my stomach churn. I pushed the door open further, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The old man lay sprawled on the floor, his throat slit, blood pooling around him. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. Panic set in, and I ran back to my RV, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. Of course, in the middle of nowhere, I thought bitterly. I considered driving to the nearest town, but I was too shaken to get behind the wheel. Instead, I armed myself with a kitchen knife and hunkered down, waiting for morning. The night was long and torturous. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't shake the image of the old man's lifeless body from my mind. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to figure out who could have done this and why. At first light, I decided to head to the campground office. Maybe they had a landline I could use to call the authorities. The office was a short walk away, but it felt like a mile with my nerves on edge. When I got there, I found the door unlocked. Inside, it was a mess. Papers strewn everywhere, shelves knocked over. The place looked like it had been ransacked. My hope of finding help quickly faded. I searched the desk and found a dusty old phone. I picked up the receiver, but there was no dial tone. Despair set in. I decided my best bet was to drive to the nearest town and report the murder. As I walked back to my RV, I saw the young couple's tent was gone. And so were they. A sense of dread filled me. What if they were the ones responsible? Or what if they had met the same fate as the old man? I hurried back to my RV, only to find a note stuck to the door with a hunting knife. The note was scrawled in a hurried, messy script. "You're next." Panic gripped me as I scrambled to get into the RV and start the engine. I didn't care about the noise. I just wanted to get out of there. As I sped down the dirt road leading away from the campground, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be chasing me. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a small town and found a police station. I stumbled in, breathless and wild-eyed, explaining everything to the officers. They took my statement and sent a couple of deputies to investigate. The rest of the day was a blur of questions and waiting. The police found the old man's body, just as I described, but there was no sign of the young couple. They assured me they would continue the investigation and advised me to stay in town for a few days just in case. I checked into a motel, grateful for the safety of 4 solid walls. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. I knew I'd never go back to that campground again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there had marked me. A few days later, the police called me in to review some footage they had recovered from the campground security cameras. The grainy footage showed the young couple packing up and leaving around the time I found the old man's body. They looked nervous, constantly glancing around as they loaded their car. Then the footage switched to the office, showing a man I didn't recognize rummaging through the place. He was tall and muscular, wearing a hoodie and gloves. He moved with a purpose, like he was looking for something specific. My heart raced as I realized this must be the killer. The police told me they were working on identifying the man and advised me to stay vigilant. I nodded, but inside I was seething with anger and fear. How had I become a target? What did this man want? The next few weeks were tense. I stayed in town, checking in with the police regularly. They hadn't made any progress in identifying the killer, and the young couple was still missing. I started to feel like I was in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. One night, as I was walking back to my motel room, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. My paranoia was getting the better of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, just as I was about to unlock my door, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, knife in hand, ready to fight. But it was one of the deputies, his face pale and serious. "We need to talk," he said, leading me to his car. He explained that they had found something at the campground, a hidden room in the old shack I had discovered. Inside, they found maps, surveillance equipment, and photos of me, the old man, and the young couple. My blood ran cold as he showed me the photos. They were taken from a distance, through the trees. The killer had been watching us the whole time. The deputy told me they were stepping up their efforts to find this man, but in the meantime they were moving me to a safe house. I spent the next few days in a state of constant anxiety, looking over my shoulder, jumping at every little noise. The safe house was secure, but I still felt vulnerable. The killer was still out there, and I had no idea why he was targeting me. Then one night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a noise outside. I crept to the window and saw a shadowy figure moving in the yard. My heart pounded as I grabbed my knife and phone, ready to call the police. But before I could dial, the door burst open, and the killer lunged at me. We struggled, crashing into furniture and knocking over lamps. He was strong, but desperation gave me an edge. I managed to stab him in the side, and he let out a grunt of pain, stumbling back. I took the opportunity to run, dashing out the back door and into the woods. I could hear him behind me, cursing and crashing through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. The chase seemed to go on forever, but eventually I lost him. I hid behind a large tree, trying to catch my breath and gather my thoughts. I had to find a way to signal for help. As I sat there, I realized something. The killer hadn't just been targeting random people. He had been watching us, studying us. There had to be a reason. I thought back to the old man, the young couple, and the maps in the hidden room. What was the connection? It hit me then. The old man had been whittling a piece of wood when I first saw him. The young couple had been arguing about something when I approached them, and I had stumbled upon the hidden room by accident. The killer was after something specific, something we had all come close to discovering. I remembered the tools I'd found in the shack and the old maps. There had to be more to this place than I realized. With renewed determination, I made my way back to the shack. It was risky, but I needed answers. I carefully approached, listening for any signs of movement. The place was eerily silent. Inside, I found the hidden room again. This time, I searched more thoroughly. Among the maps and photos, I found an old journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. It belonged to the old man detailing his search for a hidden treasure rumored to be buried in the area. The pieces started to fall into place. The killer was after the treasure, and he was eliminating anyone who got too close. I had to get this information to the police. As I left the shack, I heard footsteps behind me. The killer was back, and this time he was more determined than ever. We fought again, and I managed to get the upper hand, knocking him out with a heavy piece of wood. I tied him up with some old rope I found and ran to the nearest house, pounding on the door until someone answered. The police arrived quickly, and I handed over the journal and explained everything. The killer was arrested, and the young couple was found alive, hiding in a nearby town. They had been too scared to come forward. The old man's murder was solved, and the treasure was secured by the authorities. In the end, I left that campground with a sense of closure. The killer was behind bars, and the mystery was solved. But I knew I'd never forget that terrifying night and the old man's lifeless eyes staring up at me from the floor of his RV. I love camping and hiking. I've never been one to shy away from adventure, which is probably why I found myself in the middle of nowhere, out RV camping by Crystal Lake, nestled in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Reuben Palmer, and I've seen my share of life's ups and downs, enough to know that sometimes you just need a break from everything. This trip was supposed to be my break, my time to unwind and reconnect with nature. As I drove my rented RV along the winding forest road, the towering pines seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, and I was relying on the old-fashioned paper map I'd picked up at the last gas station. The sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. I finally spotted the small wooden sign for Crystal Lake Campground, barely visible in the fading light. The gravel crunched under the RV's tires as I turned onto the narrow access road. The campground was more rustic than I'd expected, with only a handful of RV spots scattered around the perimeter of the lake. I chose a spot far from the few other campers I'd seen on my way in, wanting to fully immerse myself in the solitude of nature. As I maneuvered the RV into place, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. No distant traffic, no hum of electricity, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional splash from the lake. Once parked, I stepped out and took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. The lake was a perfect mirror of the sky, clear and still. I set up my chair, grabbed a beer from the cooler, and settled in to enjoy the serene view. The only sounds were the distant call of a loon and the gentle rustling of leaves. It was perfect. As twilight deepened into night, I cooked up a small dinner on the portable grill and watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and frogs, a symphony that lulled me into a sense of peace. I was about to turn in for the night when a noise caught my attention. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a faint, distant cry. It sounded almost human. A chill ran down my spine as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction it had come from. Silence fell over the campsite once more, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just an animal or my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I zipped up the RV door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the RV keeping me on edge. Every snap of a twig outside sent my heart racing. It was well past midnight when I finally drifted off into a fitful sleep. I awoke with a start, disoriented in the darkness of the RV. Something had woken me, a sound. I lay perfectly still, listening intently. There it was again, a scream. This time there was no mistaking it. It was a human voice, filled with terror and pain. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my flashlight and phone. The screen showed no signal. Of course, we were in the middle of nowhere. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the instinct for self-preservation and the nagging feeling that someone out there needed help. Finally, I made my decision. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. I pulled on my boots and jacket, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped out into the night. The forest was different in the darkness, transformed into a realm of shadows and whispers. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the pressing blackness. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded small and insignificant in the vast night. No response came, but as I moved deeper into the woods, I heard something else. A rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. Footsteps, and they were coming closer. I swung my flashlight around wildly, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever was out there. The beam glanced off something pale and round, hanging from a low branch. As I moved closer, my blood ran cold. It was a mask, crudely fashioned to resemble a human face, its empty eye sockets staring back at me. That's when I heard the whisper right behind me. "Welcome to our game, Reuben." I whirled around, but there was nothing there. How did they know my name? Panic seized me and I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the sound of pursuit close behind. I could hear them laughing, enjoying the chase. I burst into a small clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. In the center stood a figure, tall and motionless, wearing one of those horrifying masks. As I watched, frozen in terror, more figures emerged from the trees surrounding me. They wore dark clothing and each carried a wickedly sharp knife. "What do you want?" I gasped, trying to keep my voice from shaking. The figure in the center tilted its head, the mask catching the moonlight. "We want to play," it said, in a voice that was almost childlike in its glee, "and you're it." As they closed in around me, I realized with horrifying clarity that this was no longer about survival. This was a game to them, and I was nothing more than prey. I made a desperate lunge, managing to break through their circle. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, branches tearing at my clothes, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear them behind me, whooping and calling, thoroughly enjoying the hunt. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, driven by pure adrenaline and the will to survive. In the distance I could see a faint light, my RV. If I could just make it there, maybe I'd have a chance. As I burst out of the tree line, I realized my mistake. They'd been hurting me, driving me right back to where I'd started. The RV door hung open, and I could see that the inside had been ransacked. I skidded to a halt, frantically looking for an escape route. That's when I saw it. A small motorboat tied up at the lake's edge. Without hesitation, I sprinted towards it, praying it had fuel. I reached the boat just as the masked figures emerged from the forest. My trembling hands fumbled with the rope, finally managing to untie it. I yanked the cord to start the engine, relief flooding through me as it roared to life. As I steered the boat out onto the dark waters of Crystal Lake, I could see them standing on the shore, their masked faces turned towards me. They made no move to pursue, simply watching as I sped away into the night. The adrenaline began to wear off as I reached the center of the lake, leaving me shaking and nauseous. What had just happened? Who were those people, and why had they targeted me? I cut the engine, letting the boat drift as I tried to catch my breath and think. The night was eerily silent now, the water around me black as ink. I had no idea which direction led to safety or if there was any safe place left. As I sat there trying to decide what to do next, a sound drifted across the water. Singing, a chorus of voices, childlike and innocent, singing a lullaby I half remembered from my own childhood. The melody sent chills down my spine. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. There, on the shore I'd just fled from, I could make out a line of small figures. Children, it seemed, standing hand in hand at the water's edge. But something was wrong with their proportions, their movements too jerky and unnatural. As I watched in horror, the children began to wade into the lake, still singing. They moved with unnatural speed, and I realized with a jolt of terror that they were coming towards me. I yanked the cord to restart the engine, but it sputtered and died. I tried again and again, panic rising as the singing grew louder. The boat rocked as something bumped against it from below. A small, pale hand reached over the side of the boat, its fingers unnaturally long and tipped with sharp claws. As I stared, frozen in terror, a face rose from the water, a child's face, but wrong somehow, its features twisted and inhuman. It smiled at me, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Time to play," it said in a gurgling voice. I screamed as more hands grasped the boat, rocking it violently. Water sloshed over the sides as the creatures, for they couldn't be human children, tried to climb aboard. I grabbed an oar, swinging it wildly to fend them off. In my panic, I didn't notice the larger shape moving beneath the boat until it was too late. With a tremendous crash, something huge breached the surface, capsizing the small craft and sending me plunging into the icy water. I thrashed in the darkness, disoriented and terrified. Something brushed against my leg and I kicked out frantically. My head broke the surface and I gasped for air, trying to spot the shore in the darkness. A sound behind me made me turn, and I found myself face to face with a massive serpentine head rising from the water. Its eyes glowed with an unearthly light, and its mouth gaped open, revealing row upon row of dagger-like teeth. I swam for my life, my arms and legs burning with the effort. Behind me I could hear the thing moving through the water, gaining on me with every second. The shore seemed impossibly far away. Just as I felt the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck, my feet touched the bottom. I staggered onto the beach, collapsing on the sand as I turned to face my pursuer. But there was nothing there. The lake was calm and still, showing no sign of the monster that had chased me. Had I imagined it all? As I lay there, panting and shivering, I became aware of presences around me. I looked up to see the masked figures standing in a circle looking down at me. They were perfectly still, their blank mask faces betraying no emotion. "Congratulations," said the one I recognized as the leader. "You've made it to the next level." As unconsciousness claimed me, I realized with dawning horror that my ordeal was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. I awoke to the sound of birdsong, sunlight streaming through the trees. For a moment, I thought it had all been a terrible nightmare, but as I sat up, wincing at the pain in my battered body, I knew it had been all too real. I was lying on the beach where I'd collapsed, but there was no sign of the masked figures or the monstrous children. The lake sparkled innocently in the morning light, giving no hint of the horrors it had held the night before. Stiffly I got to my feet and looked around. My RV was where I'd left it, the door still hanging open. But when I approached, I saw that the interior had been put back in order. There was no sign of the ransacking I'd seen the night before. On the small table inside, I found a note written in elegant script. "Well played, Reuben. You've passed the first test, but the game is far from over. We'll be watching. Sweet dreams." I crumpled the note in my fist, a mix of anger and fear churning in my gut. Who were these people? What kind of sick game were they playing? I wanted nothing more than to jump in the RV and drive away as fast as I could. But as I looked at the winding road leading out of the campground, I hesitated. What if that was part of their plan? What if they were waiting for me out there? And what about the other campers I'd seen when I arrived? Had they been part of this twisted game too? Or were they innocent victims like me? I couldn't just leave them here. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone. Still no signal. I tried the RV's radio, but got nothing but static on every channel. It seemed I was well and truly cut off from the outside world. As the full weight of my situation settled on me, I sank into the RV's small kitchenette chair, my mind racing. I had no idea what these people wanted from me or why they had chosen me for their game. But one thing was clear. If I wanted to survive, I would have to play along, at least for now. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves and think rationally. I needed a plan. First things first, I had to secure the RV as best I could. I spent the next hour reinforcing the door and windows with what I had on hand. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. Next, I took stock of my supplies. I had enough food and water to last a few days if I rationed carefully. The first aid kit was well stocked, which was a small mercy given the cuts and bruises I'd acquired during the night. As I tended to my wounds, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The masked figures were terrifying, but at least they were human. But those things in the lake, I shuddered at the memory. How could such creatures exist? And how had no one ever reported seeing them before? A movement outside caught my eye, and I froze. Through the RV window, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was a child, a normal-looking child this time, not like the monstrosities from the lake. She stood perfectly still, staring at me with an unnervingly blank expression. I blinked, and she was gone. Had I imagined her? Was my mind starting to play tricks on me? As the day wore on, I found myself jumping at every sound, peering nervously out the windows at every shadow. The forest that had seemed so peaceful yesterday now felt oppressive and threatening. I knew they were out there, watching me, waiting for their next move. As the sun began to set, my dread grew. What horrors would the coming night bring? I didn't want to find out, but I knew I had no choice. This was their game, and for now, I had to play by their rules. I checked my makeshift fortifications one last time and settled in for another sleepless night. As darkness fell, the sounds of the forest changed. Was that just the wind in the trees or whispered voices? Was that creak just the RV settling, or footsteps on the roof? I clutched my improvised weapon, a kitchen knife taped to the end of a broom handle, and waited, every nerve on edge. Whatever came, I would be ready. I had to be. Because in this game, losing meant more than just defeat. It meant death. The night stretched on, each hour feeling like an eternity. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, inhuman shrieks, haunting laughter, and once what sounded like my own voice calling out in pain. I knew it was all part of their psychological warfare, but knowing didn't make it any less terrifying. As dawn approached, I felt myself starting to drift off, exhaustion finally overpowering fear. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping at the door. Tap, tap, tap. I gripped my makeshift spear tighter, holding my breath. The tapping continued, steady and insistent. Then a child's voice spoke. "Mr. Palmer, are you awake? I'm lost. Can you help me?" Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. But what if it wasn't? What if there really was a lost child out there? Could I live with myself if I turned away someone who genuinely needed help? Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door. Through the small window, I could see a small figure standing outside. It looked like a normal little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with pigtails and a tear-stained face. She looked up at me pleadingly. "Please, mister, I'm scared." My hand hesitated on the door handle. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, warning me not to open the door. But this wasn't a movie. This was real life, wasn't it? With a deep breath, I made my decision. I opened the door. The girl's face split into a wide grin, far too wide to be natural. Her eyes began to glow with an eerie light, and her form seemed to shimmer and twist. "Thank you for inviting me in," the girl said, her voice distorting into something inhuman. "Now the real fun can begin." I stumbled backward, my makeshift spear clattering to the floor. The girl's form continued to twist and grow, her limbs elongating impossibly. In seconds, she had transformed into a nightmarish creature that barely fit inside the RV. I scrambled for the spear, but a long, clawed hand wrapped around my ankle, yanking me off my feet. I was dragged across the floor, my fingernails leaving scratches in the linoleum as I desperately tried to find purchase. The creature lifted me effortlessly, bringing me face to face with what had once been a little girl. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. The stench of decay washed over me and I gagged. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to choke out. The creature tilted its head, an eerily human gesture. "Because it's fun," it said simply. Then it threw me. I crashed through the RV window, shards of glass slicing into my skin as I hit the ground outside. Pain lanced through my body, but adrenaline kept me moving. I staggered to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. The forest was a blur around me as I crashed through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going. Behind me, I could hear the creature's inhuman shrieks as it gave chase. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond away. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and battered. As I tried to orient myself, I realized I was lying next to a small stream. The water gurgled peacefully, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few minutes. For a moment, all was quiet. Had I lost the creature? I held my breath, listening intently. Nothing. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. In the pre-dawn light, I could just make out my surroundings. The embankment I'd fallen down was steep, almost cliff-like. To my right, the stream flowed into what looked like the mouth of a cave. I hesitated. The cave could be a good hiding place, but it could also be a dead end. Before I could decide, I heard a blood-curdling screech from above. The creature had found me. Without further hesitation, I plunged into the cave. The darkness swallowed me whole as I stumbled forward, one hand on the damp wall to guide me. Behind me, I could hear the creature scrambling down the embankment, its claws scraping against rock. The cave narrowed, forcing me to squeeze through tight passages. My clothes caught on sharp rocks, tearing. My breath came in ragged gasps, echoing off the stone walls. Suddenly, my questing hand met empty air. The passage opened up into a larger cavern. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls of the cavern were covered in crude paintings, stick figures being chased by monstrous shapes, scenes of torture and dismemberment, and everywhere a symbol that looked like an eye inside a triangle. A soft glow emanated from the far end of the cavern. As I approached, I saw that it came from a pool of water. The liquid glowed with an unearthly blue light, casting eerie shadows around the cave. I had only a moment to take this in before I heard the creature entering the cavern behind me. In desperation, I dove into the glowing pool. The water was icy cold, shocking the breath from my lungs. I expected to hit bottom quickly, but instead found myself sinking deeper and deeper. The glowing liquid surrounded me, and a strange tingling sensation spread across my skin. Just as my lungs were about to burst, my feet touched solid ground. I pushed off, rocketing to the surface. As my head broke the water, I gasped for air, blinking the luminescent liquid from my eyes. I found myself in another cave, lit by the same eerie blue glow. But this one was different. The air felt charged with energy, and strange symbols floated in the air, shimmering like heat mirages. As I pulled myself out of the pool, I noticed something else. The cuts and bruises I'd accumulated during my flight through the forest were gone. My body felt renewed, somehow. Stronger. "Welcome, Reuben," a voice said behind me. "We've been expecting you." I whirled around to find myself face to face with a group of people. They wore robes adorned with the same eye and triangle symbol I'd seen in the other cave. Their faces were kind, but their eyes held an otherworldly wisdom that made me shiver. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What is this place?" The apparent leader, an elderly man with a long white beard, stepped forward. "We are the Guardians," he said. "And this is the Nexus, the place where all realities converge." My mind reeled. "I don't understand." The old man smiled gently. "The creatures you encountered, the game you've been forced to play, they are not of your world. They are invaders from another reality, one where the laws of nature are different. We've been fighting them for centuries," a woman added, "keeping them contained, protecting your world and countless others from their influence. But lately they've grown stronger. The barriers between worlds are weakening." I shook my head, trying to process this information. But why me? Why was I chosen for this game? The old man's expression grew serious. "Because you have a gift, Reuben, a strength of will that allowed you to resist their influence, to see through their illusions. It's why you were able to find the Nexus." "We need your help," another guardian said, "to turn the tide, to push back the darkness." I laughed bitterly. "Me? I'm nobody. I couldn't even protect myself, let alone other worlds." The old man placed a hand on my shoulder. I felt a surge of energy flow through me. "You are far more than you know, Reuben, and you have a choice to make. You can return to your world, try to forget what you've seen, or you can join us, fight back, become a guardian yourself." As he spoke, images flashed through my mind. Other worlds, beautiful and terrible. The creatures I'd encountered, and worse ones, wreaking havoc across realities. But I also saw hope. People, humans and otherwise, standing against the darkness. I thought about my life before all this. My boring job, my failed relationships, the emptiness I'd felt that had driven me to go camping in the first place. And I realized that for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. I looked at the Guardians, my decision made. What do I need to do? The old man smiled, a twinkle in his eye. "First," he said, "you need to wake up." I blinked in confusion. "What?" The cave began to fade around me. The Guardians' faces blurred. I felt like I was falling. "Wake up, Reuben," the old man's voice echoed. "Wake up and remember, the real test is about to begin." My eyes snapped open. I was back in my RV, lying on the small bed. Sunlight streamed through the windows. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream. Then I saw the note on the table, the one left by my tormentors. But now, there was something else written below their message, in a different hand, in letters that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. The Nexus is real. The choice is yours. We'll be waiting. I stared at the note, my mind reeling. Was any of it real? The creatures, the guardians, the Nexus? Or was it all part of some elaborate hallucination? As if in answer, I felt a tingling sensation in my hand. I looked down to see a small symbol appearing on my palm, an eye inside a triangle. It glowed faintly for a moment, then faded, leaving only a faint outline behind. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. Whether it was real or not, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay here. Whatever was happening, whatever force was at work, I needed answers. With newfound determination, I began to pack up the RV. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go back to my old life, not after what I'd experienced. As I pulled out of the campground, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a group of robed figures standing at the edge of the forest, watching me go. But when I looked again, they were gone. I turned onto the main road, my hand steady on the wheel. I didn't know what lay ahead, what challenges or horrors I might face. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose. The game wasn't over. In fact, I realized it had only just begun. And this time, I intended to be more than just a pawn. As the RV picked up speed, carrying me towards an uncertain future, I couldn't help but smile. Whatever came next, I was ready. The real adventure was just beginning. I've always loved camping and hiking. There's something about the crisp mountain air, the rustling of leaves and the gentle babbling of streams that soothes my soul like nothing else. For years I've sought solace in the wilderness, escaping the chaos of city life to find peace among the trees. But one fateful trip changed everything, turning my sanctuary into a nightmare that continues to haunt me to this day. It was late September when I decided to take a solo RV camping trip to the Sierra Nevada foothills. Work had been stressful, and I desperately needed to clear my head. I chose a secluded spot off the beaten path, a place recommended by an old friend, Ralph. He swore by its tranquility and untouched beauty, describing it as a little slice of heaven. As I drove my RV along the winding mountain roads, the familiar excitement of a new adventure coursed through my veins. The further I got from civilization, the more my troubles seemed to melt away. By the time I reached the turnoff for the campsite, I was already feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The site was everything Ralph had promised and more. Nestled between towering pines, it offered a breathtaking view of a small, serene lake. The water sparkled in the late afternoon sun, its surface broken only by the occasional jump of a fish. I couldn't help but smile as I set up camp, feeling like I had stumbled upon my own private paradise. That first day was blissful. I spent the morning hiking around the lake, marveling at the diverse flora and fauna. In the afternoon, I tried my hand at fishing, managing to catch a couple of plump trout for dinner. As the sun began to set, I lit a campfire and prepared my meal, savoring the simple pleasure of food cooked over an open flame. After dinner, I leaned back in my camping chair, gazing up at the night sky. The stars were incredible out here, far from the light pollution of the city. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a cosmic river, and I felt small yet somehow connected to the vastness of the universe. It was well past midnight when I finally decided to turn in. I double-checked the locks on the RV out of habit before crawling into my sleeping bag. The gentle sounds of the forest lulled me to sleep, and for a few hours I slept more peacefully than I had in years. But then, sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke with a start. At first I couldn't pinpoint what had roused me. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual nighttime sounds conspicuously absent. I lay still, straining my ears when I heard it, a faint crunching sound like footsteps on gravel. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon foraging for food. but a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The footsteps sounded too deliberate, too human. I reached for my phone, the screen's glow momentarily blinding me. 3:27 a.m. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the rational part of my brain insisted I investigate. After all, I was miles from the nearest town. If someone was out there, they might need help. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously stepped out of the RV. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, instantly banishing any lingering drowsiness. I swept the beam of light across the campsite, half expecting to see a startled animal scurrying away. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. At the edge of the light's reach stood a figure. Human-shaped but unnaturally still, it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The figure remained motionless, watching. I took a tentative step forward, and that's when it moved, retreating into the shadows with unnatural speed. I stumbled backward, nearly falling in my haste to get back to the RV. Once inside, I locked the door and grabbed the small handgun I kept for emergencies. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat in the driver's seat, gun in hand, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. As the hours crawled by, my mind raced with possibilities. Was it a homeless person, a fugitive, or something else? When the first light of dawn finally broke, I wasted no time in packing up. Whatever I had seen, I had no desire to stick around and find out more. I drove to the nearest ranger station, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The ranger on duty, a grizzled old man named Jed, listened to my story with a grave expression. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "There have been rumors," he said slowly, "of people living off the grid in these parts, folks who don't take kindly to strangers." His words sent a chill down my spine. I thanked him for his time and drove back to the city, eager to put the whole experience behind me. But as the days passed, I began to notice things. A car that seemed to follow me for a few blocks too long. A stranger watching me a little too intently at the grocery store. At first I dismissed it as paranoia, the lingering effects of my frightening experience. Then came the note. I found it slipped under my apartment door one evening, a single line scrawled on a piece of paper. "You should have stayed away." I took it to the police, but without any fingerprints or concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. From that moment on, I lived in a constant state of fear. Every shadow held a potential threat, every stranger a possible enemy. I installed new locks, bought security cameras, but nothing could shake the feeling that I was being watched. 2 nights ago, I heard someone outside my apartment. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. In the morning, another note awaited me. "We're closer than you think." That was the last straw. I decided to confront Ralph, the friend who had suggested the campsite. When I showed up at his place unannounced, he seemed genuinely surprised to see me. I explained everything that had happened, watching his reaction closely. Ralph's confusion appeared genuine, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of fear, perhaps. "I swear I didn't tell anyone about your trip," he said. "But there is something I didn't mention before. That spot, it's been known to be, well, kind of sketchy. Some people say there's a cult out there, living in the woods." I felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. "A cult? And you didn't think to mention this before?" Ralph had the decency to look ashamed. I didn't believe it. I thought it was just stories. Hell, I've camped there a few times myself without any trouble. I left Ralph's place feeling more confused and terrified than ever. If it was a cult, what did they want with me? Why were they following me? I knew I should go back to the police, but what could I tell them? That I was being stalked by a group of forest-dwelling cultists? No, I realized with a sinking feeling, this was something I would have to handle on my own. The next day I drove back to the campsite. It was a foolish decision, born of desperation and a need for answers. I armed myself this time, bringing not only my handgun but also a hunting rifle. As I approached the turnoff to the site, my hands were sweating so much I could barely grip the steering wheel. The campsite looked much as I remembered it, peaceful and inviting in the afternoon sun, but now I knew better. I parked the RV and began to search the area, looking for any signs of habitation or recent activity. After an hour of fruitless searching, I was about to give up when I spotted something through the trees, a flash of color that didn't belong in the forest. Cautiously, I made my way toward it. What I found sent a chill through my body. Hidden in a small clearing was a makeshift campsite. Tattered tarps stretched between trees formed crude shelters. The remains of a fire smoldered in a pit, wisps of smoke still rising from the embers. Food wrappers and other detritus were scattered about, suggesting recent occupation. I was examining a strange symbol carved into a tree trunk when I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around, rifle at the ready, to find myself face to face with a man. He was tall and unkempt, with wild eyes and a tangled beard. For a moment we just stared at each other, both too shocked to move. Then he bolted, crashing through the underbrush. Without thinking, I gave chase. We ran through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. The man was fast, but fear and adrenaline propelled me forward. I caught up to him just as he stumbled over a fallen log. We went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling across the forest floor. He fought like a cornered animal, all nails and teeth, but I had the advantage of size and desperation. Finally, I managed to pin him down, pressing the barrel of my rifle against his chest. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, my voice hoarse and ragged. The man glared up at me, a mixture of fear and defiance in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come back," he spat. "Why? What do you want from me?" Before he could answer, a noise made me look up. My heart sank as I saw more figures emerging from the trees, encircling us. I counted 5 men, all armed, all looking as wild and unkempt as the one I had caught. "Let him go," one of them said, a big man with a deep, gravelly voice. "You're outnumbered." Slowly I got to my feet, keeping my rifle trained on the man I had tackled. "Who are you people?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The big man stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "We're just trying to live our lives," he said. "Off the grid, away from the corruption of society. You stumbled into our home." "That's all? You're just campers?" He chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Not exactly. We've got our own ways, our own rules, and we don't like outsiders." I glanced around at the men surrounding me, realizing just how precarious my situation was. "I'll leave," I said. "I won't come back. Just let me go." The big man considered for a moment, then nodded. "That's wise. Take your things and go. Don't ever come back here." I backed away slowly, not lowering my rifle until I was sure they weren't going to shoot me in the back. When I reached my RV, I threw my gear inside and drove away as fast as I dared on the winding forest roads, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I went straight to the police station. This time they took my story more seriously. They sent a team out to investigate, but when they returned, they reported that the campsite was deserted. There was no sign of the men or their makeshift camp. Now I'm back in my apartment trying to make sense of it all. I've installed more security measures, changed my routines, even considered moving to a new city. But deep down I know it won't matter. Whatever I encountered out there in the woods, whatever strange group I stumbled upon, they know who I am. They know where I live. Every night I lie awake, listening for footsteps outside my door. Every shadow on the street could be one of them, watching, waiting. I don't know if they'll come for me again or what they want. All I know is that I'll never feel truly safe again. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, has become a source of terror. The very thought of trees and mountains fills me with dread. I've sold my RV and camping gear, unable to even look at them without feeling a surge of panic. Sometimes in my darkest moments I wonder if I should have stayed in those woods, if perhaps joining their strange community would have been better than this constant fear. But then I remind myself of the madness I saw in their eyes, the barely contained violence in their movements. No, I made the right choice in escaping. But escape, I'm learning, is not the same as freedom. I may have left the forest, but I brought something back with me, an unshakable sense of being hunted, a knowledge that somewhere out there in the shadows of the Sierra, a group of men are watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. And so I wait too, caught in a limbo of fear and vigilance, wondering when, not if, they will make their next move. The wilderness I once loved has revealed its darkest secret, and I am forever changed by what I've seen. The peace I sought in nature has been replaced by a terror that follows me, even in the heart of the city. Every time my phone rings, every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face on the street, each is a potential harbinger of doom. I've become a prisoner of my own paranoia, the walls of my apartment both a sanctuary and a cage. As I write this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Is that a shadow moving outside my window, or just a trick of the light? Is that a footstep in the hallway, or just my neighbor returning home? I don't know how this story ends. Perhaps one day I'll find the courage to confront my fears, to return to those woods and face whatever awaits me there. Or perhaps I'll spend the rest of my days looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. One thing is certain, I've always loved camping and hiking, but now the very thought of the wilderness fills me with a primal, unshakable dread. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of them are better left undiscovered.